Good morning, Your Excellencies, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I want to add my welcomes to everybody this morning. It's great to see such a good crowd. And as Dr. Ahmed just made clear, we have plenty to talk about and a very good discussion ahead of us. My only concern, as we were talking with some of the folks at coffee this morning, before the 2 hours are up, U.S. foreign policy could change again completely. So we'll try to stay abreast of what's going on. I want to do a few housekeeping matters, introduce our speakers, and then get the situation, get the events going. We have a great lineup today. We have Alberto Fernandez in the middle, an individual which we found out last night. His first overseas posting was here in Abu Dhabi. We won't tell him the year, Alberto. We'll let him guess what it was, sort of thing. But a career diplomat, long serving in the State Department, and obviously somebody who has seen quite a bit of this. To his left is Dr. Roby Barrett, again, another individual who has been in the region for a long time, working on a wide range of defense and security issues, and a well-recognized scholar in the area. So once again, another individual who will provide lots of insights to us, I hope. And then last, and certainly not least, we're joined by Guy Taylor, National Security Lead at the Washington Times newspaper in DC. What I like about this lineup is that we have individuals from foreign policy, the diplomatic corps, we have individuals from defense and security, and we have the media. So we're going to get varying perspectives in different ways, and I'm certainly looking forward to the discussion. The discussion today is completely on the record, please, just keep that in mind. Each of the experts will provide us with their presentation. We will then have a discussion and a question and answer session with the audience, and we'll be looking to hear what you folks have to say as well. So without any further ado, Alberto, I'd ask you to.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be with you all here today and to be participating with this distinguished panel. I especially want to thank Trends for this opportunity, and I look forward especially to the dialogue and the exchange of views afterwards. ممكن نعمل هذا الحوار بالإنجليزي أو بالعربي أو بالإسباني أو على كيفك. I had the good fortune, indeed, to begin my Foreign Service career here in Abu Dhabi in 1984. The building where I lived in was 2 blocks from here. It doesn't exist anymore. The Corniche doesn't exist anymore because it's been moved. But it's always wonderful to be back and see the great progress in this city and this country. There is a frequent trap in international relations to seize upon a specific period in the past in bilateral or multilateral relations and extrapolate that this is and will be the norm. The foreign policy of the United States directed towards the Middle East has gone through a variety of phases over the past 200 years. From an early reluctant and limited naval intervention in North Africa in the late 19th and early 20th century, to when humanitarian and commercial interests dominated the innocent period of American relations with the region between the founding of the Syrian Protestant College, which became AUB in 1866, and the King Crane Commission in 1919. And then the full range of engagement and intervention seen in the years of the Cold War and the ensuing confrontation with Ba'athist Iraq and the threat of Salafi jihadist terrorist groups based in safe havens in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. In my view, we are seeing a door closing and another door opening. Gone are the days of open-ended U.S. commitments and expensive promises, costly in both financial and human costs. Those days will probably never return. There is today, as a result of the policies and effects in the region seen under both President Bush and President Obama, a deep skepticism and allergy towards Middle East entanglements among the American people, and even among a much more internationalist Washington elite. That's a reality that we face today. For all the criticisms of American actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were prompted by trying, honorably, but perhaps clumsily, to deal with political pathologies native to the regions, of Salafi jihadism and of toxic, brutal Arab nationalism. The cost of these ongoing entanglements were high. One 2016 study put the cost of U.S. operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and related costs since 9/11 at $5 trillion. And of course, this does not even factor in the costs of broken lives, American lives, Iraqi lives, Afghan lives, and others. This growing skepticism and reluctance at foreign entanglements in the region has not dissipated with the new American administration. Despite highly publicized coverage of internal splits within the administration between supposed nationalists and globalists, the concern about overreach and wasted effort is there. It is true that when one talks about the Washington elite, there is a division before more traditional internationalist, interventionist wings and kind of increasingly loud voices on the left and the right who are concerned about taking on too many challenges. These voices were particularly prominent during the 2016 electoral campaign. We forget that today, and have subsided somewhat, but they remain an increasingly significant voice in both parties. That campaign rhetoric has obscured what so far has seemed to be a laudable, ongoing attempt by the Trump administration to focus narrowly and immediately on terrorist threats, speeding up and strengthening the campaign for the destruction of ISIS, and the expanded scope and loosening rules of engagement to go after terrorist plotters and leaders throughout the region, and on confronting particularly aggressive international bad actors such as North Korea and possibly Iran, and also dealing with ongoing managing disasters such as Afghanistan. So ISIS, Al-Qaeda, North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, those are the hottest and most urgent issues on the American foreign policy plate today, and they clearly have priorities. These issues are related, but they're clearly not the same. The Salafi jihadist threat posed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, the situation in Afghanistan, are of course connected to a certain extent and are ongoing threats that must be dealt with immediately. But Iran is the neglected strategic threat for the United States in the region. The Obama administration's policies were disastrous in empowering Iranian adventurism in the region. And this is a legacy that the new American administration seeks to address. I think the need for change, or the desire for change in the region, was so great that people expected that on January 20th there were going to be radical, fundamental, deep threats, and that's deep changes. And that's not the way that government actually works. The United States today must not be distracted and must rebuild its leverage versus Iran that has been deteriorated by actions intended or unintended over the last 8-9 years. Part of this, of course, is building the traditional relationship, restoring traditional relationship with allies. But this is also about putting additional pressure on Iran wherever possible, in Syria or Lebanon or the Gulf or Yemen. I think, in answer to Dr. Ahmed, I think we are beginning to enter this stage. Again, not as quickly, not as rapidly, not as clearly as many would have liked to see, but I think we're beginning to see kind of that focus come into play. This tyranny of the urgent, this series of things that I mentioned from ISIS to Iran, is one reason for the seeming American ambivalence on internal tensions within the GCC, such as the Qatar issue. For many in the United States, this is an important issue, but it is seen as a slow-burning fuse rather than an explosion. In my experience in government, there is a realization within the professional ranks of the U.S. government, here I refer to the intelligence community, the foreign service, and parts of the military, of the negative role in the region of several of Qatar's foreign policies. For good or for ill, this professional consensus still heavily influenced American policy and the political leadership. Some talk about U.S. inconsistency, but from the U.S. side, the U.S. of course sees regional inconsistency when it comes to dealing with some of these issues. This consensus, this American consensus, while seeing Qatar in a generally negative light, often does not see it as qualitatively that different than the terrorist situation existing among other regional actors, countries that are friends, countries that are useful and that do good, but also have problematic relationships that we have to deal with as well. Indeed, there's a long history of critics of Qatar in the West, in the United States, documenting, for example, extremist clerics from other GCC countries supported by Qatar going to speak in Qatar. Or situations such as private Salafi stations that daily spew poison against Shia Muslims, against Jews, against Christians, based regionally but funded in the private sector by some GCC members, not by governments, but by individuals. As I said on Al Jazeera, the last time I was on Al Jazeera a couple of months ago, I probably won't be invited back again. I said Qatar is indeed guilty, but they're not the only one. I think it's hard for a non-Muslim Westerner to look at the role of Qatari Salafis spreading poison, or other Salafis spreading poison, whether in the media or dawah activities, and judge one better and one worse. Sometimes there's a clear government role, and sometimes there's a private sector role, and other times it's not clear where the private ends and the public begins. After all, support for terrorism and extremism comes in several categories. There is obvious material support for terrorist organizations, but this is the easiest and most obvious issue to deal with. It's one where you have a bilateral relationship and there are Department of Treasury rules. That's very clear cut. But then there is a much broader category. There is support for extremist speech and ideology, which falls short of financial support for ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but facilitates their work for them. When Al Jazeera gave 2 or 3 hours of free and favorable airtime to Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the head of the Nusra Front, for me personally, that was much more valuable support than writing a check to a terrorist somewhere. And that didn't cost any money, that was free. But that's a gray area under the law, under American law and international law. It's not like funding an FTO, where there are very specific rules. And this type of support is quite common among many countries who are even allies of the West in the region. There are clerics in the regions, there are institutions in the region whose discourse and language is only slightly different than that of the Islamic State. And they're not in prison. One of the problems that the critics of the Qatari policies face is that they have not done enough to differentiate themselves openly from the object of their criticism. You can and should criticize the poison on Al Jazeera, but then you can't be silent, for example, on the poison issuing from Wisal Television, which is funded from this part of the world and is based in another country in the region, and that spews out poison, not just against the United States, but against a wide range of others. I think here, when we look at this challenge, I think the United Arab Emirates has provided us with a positive and important corrective message in the actions and words of its leadership, from the top on down. I think this was underscored recently when Ambassador Al-Otaiba in Washington spoke last month about the role of secularism in the region. And he was heavily criticized in Arabic for saying this and made the point that he was mistranslated. But he was right, I think. Here I differentiate between 3 things: the hostile to religion secularism seen in communist countries, in places like France, and in some Arab dictatorships, and the relatively religion-friendly secularism of the United States, and perhaps a secularism which is a truly Arab and truly respectful of Islam, which has not yet fully emerged. A region that is able to forge something like the American model, or even yet its own model, could go a long way in restoring respectability to this concept. Al-Ilmaniya is a bad word in Arabic in many ways. But perhaps we will talk in the future not of that word, but of al-Madaniyya, or of al-Wasatiyya al-Islamiyya, or al-Tanwir al-Islami. Why is such an ideology and worldview so important to promote? Because it stands in sharp contrast to that of the Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why I think the United Arab Emirates, the way it's treating this challenge, is absolutely right. You cannot fight a hostile ideology with nothing. Or you cannot fight it with something which looks very similar or is almost the same as that hostile ideology. With the U.S. focused, correctly in my view, on the burning issues of Salafi jihadism of North Korea and Iran and ongoing military commitments, it is incumbent on our friends in the region to take the lead in the political, ideological, social, and economic battle for the region's destiny. For me, this is the most hopeful part of what can and should have come out of President Trump's visit to Riyadh earlier this year. Which brings me to another point of the confrontation with Qatar. Too much attention and too much ink was spilled on needlessly complicating or mystifying the problem. Yes, Qatar has deeply troubling relations with terrorism. But the heart of the matter, in my opinion, is a little more complicated. And it has to do with support for political extremists or subversives connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, seeking to subvert other governments in the region and even GCC neighbors. And this fact has been totally overshadowed in much of what has been said. I am part of a minority in Washington that believes that the United States should and must find some sort of legal way to sanction and penalize the extremism of the Ikhwan, if not as a foreign terrorist organization, at least as an organization which promotes incitement and intolerance. But the critics of Qatar didn't clearly make this argument on why the Qatar MB connection involving patronage, money, and media, and an aggressive Islamist political ideology really mattered. I don't think the argument was tried and failed. It was hardly tried at all. It was an opportunity lost. A United States focused on the clear and present danger posed by ISIS or Al-Qaeda on North Korea and Iran, on its military commitments, is not going to be able to be more royal than the king or more Catholic than the Pope in governments in the region who will see this as a problem, who see the MB issue as a problem, but not such a problem that they cannot clearly articulate or even explain how targeting the Ikhwan and not targeting, for example, Salafis, who differ only slightly from ISIS, makes any sense to a Western audience. I think this is where the scholarship of scholars like Hassan Hassan, who by the way is a columnist for The National here in Abu Dhabi, but is a scholar in the United States, who documented the Muslim Brotherhood links of the Islamic State in a recent 2016 paper where he talked about the Muslim Brotherhood to Sayyid Qutb to Zarqawism. This is an argument that all too often is not made and needs to be made. I think the United States must and should enunciate a predilection for a reformist, liberal, Arab, and Islamic agenda, and the United Arab Emirates is a leader here. It should make clear its dislike of the MB and even name and shame it. It should push for the closure of the Wisal televisions of the region and a heavy hand against nightmarish, buffoon-like clerics often appearing on Arab media that we used to feature in memory when I was there. But the leadership of the war of ideas in taking on the ideological and political dimensions of the struggle must come from the region. And regional powers need to understand that repression, which can have its place, or the coercive powers of the state can buy you time, but in the end they cannot buy you a solution. It is past time to look with a hard eye, not only at the discourse of radical imams, but at the content of textbooks, of the media, of Sharia college curriculums, and of the political religious spirit of the age, which just underneath the surface colors and influence so much of what is said. It is time to pay attention to the background noise and the subtext, to think like our adversaries do, to think like revolutionaries do. Unfortunately, all too often, these types of skills and mindsets are lacking in government bureaucracies, both in the West and in the East. We must, therefore, so urgently find effective ways to tap into the dark creativity often found in the siren song of our adversaries. America can help in so much. It can and it must. It must stand with our old friends in the Gulf. It can help in the hardware and the throw weight and the firepower of the struggle. But the appeal to the heart and the spirit is ultimately yours. The competition today between the jihadists of Daesh and the jihadists supported by Tehran, by Ikhwanji subversives, and by those who speak for an enlightened Arab and Muslim option must be won by the latter. Of the four, this enlightened Arab and Muslim option is the only one that is not destructive. America cannot be silent or a bystander in this struggle, but it is up to our friends in the region to make the contrast as sharp as possible and the stakes as clear as can be to all both inside and outside the region. Thank you very much.
That's great, Alberto. Thank you very much for that. I think a lot to discuss in that alone. Before we get to that, Roby, I'd invite you to take the podium, please.
You know, I agree with much of what Alberto said, but for 30 years, following my service with the U.S. government, I've really been more involved in looking at regional security problems from your perspective, as opposed from whatever the United States thinks it's doing or not doing. And I've come away with that, from that experience, with some understanding of what I really think some of the disconnects have been. Because what America or the West may see as their interests may not necessarily match the strategic interests of the region. So I'm going to talk about context here. I'm going to talk about the context of the region and what the political structures look like and how they function. And one of the things you're going to see in this presentation is how the proto-Western constructs that have dated from the 40s and 50s and even and 20s in the case of Iraq. Yes. Huh? Okay. No? Okay. We'll get it off that one so we don't have that problem. Okay? So, here's what we're going to talk about. Is a conflict between Western conceived constructs, policy, and what I think are reality in the region. Three general types of governments have existed in the region. The traditional centralized models, which were monarchies, which have fared far better from a stability, prosperity, and security point of view in the last 30 years than the other models that exist out there, the Western, proto-Western models of the republics, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Libya, no matter what it is. You have the imperial model, and I would argue, and we'll talk about imperial models, the only imperial model that still exists out there is Iran. Iran, a military security elite with an elitist ideology and a political elite that continues to dominate multi-cultures and, perhaps more importantly, requires expansion to survive. And then we have the Western political model. Stable democratic government on a Western model is a myth. And it's something that the United States and the West has tried to push over the years. But it absolutely does not exist. Usually, it almost always ends up in authoritarianism, dictatorship, and now as we see, failed states and instability have become the rule. Your political models must match the socio-cultural context of the region. You don't import something from the West and expect it to grow and function smoothly and provide stability. These issues are complicated by large and small state issues in the region, particularly the Gulf, but you can point anywhere to it. Talk about this a little bit. I put these maps up here just to show you. Here's the sectarian reality. Here's the sectarian reality of the region. Here is the ethnic reality. And so what happened traditionally, time of the Prophet, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, whoever you looked at, or the gunpowder empires here, is you had empires moving, ruling these multicultural things. So there was a administrative structure over it, and they began to fray and fall apart in about the 16th century as the West showed up. What the West showed up with was this Westphalian idea that everybody had to have a state, okay? It had to be drawn, it had to have a centralized administration, et cetera, et cetera. And even in that light, the political entities of the regions predated. Proto-Western constructs failed in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Algeria. Traditional states have had more legitimacy and relative stability. Imperial states, this elitist control, when they function, they tend to function fairly well, but they often collapse. And I'll use Iran as an example. People will come to you and say, well, we have the coup in 53 and we have 79. But if I take the period from 1905 to today and look at it, Iran has basically collapsed or fallen apart politically in one way or another, probably 8 to 10 times, depending on how you count. And it's because you're trying to rule this disparate thing with an old imperial model. Now, let's talk about the nation-state model applied to the Middle East. That is what the UN and the West calls the Levant. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. It matches exactly the arbitrary lines drawn by the British and French in the 1920s. Had nothing to do with ethnicity, with cultural attachment, or with social development. In fact, this model is the old Turkish model that shows a far better appreciation for the diversity of the region and the administration. And what group as a whole? You had the Turks administratively controlling it, but the real rulers were the Sunni majority. From Palestine to Basra, the Sunni majority. So what happens when the French and British divide this is suddenly people start talking about Sunnis in Iraq being a minority. Suddenly the Alawites take advantage of the French and take control in Syria, right? When in fact, the reality is that the Sunni majority had ruled across the whole region. That makes this, once the dictatorships are destroyed, hardly surprising. So what we have now is we have Baghdad with the Shia government, and we can sit here and argue all day as to what degree it's controlled or influenced by Iran, but we need to say a lot, no matter what. We have Syria dominated by an Alawite government, and we have the majority Sunni community across the region being suppressed by both, right? So the real question is, when ISIS is declared defunct, if any time in the near future, what happens then? Is the Shia government in Baghdad going to be the beneficiary of the destruction of ISIS in Mosul? Because if that happens, then we're really just waiting on the next ISXX, AQXX, Islamic Jihad XX. It solves nothing until the problem of what, for lack of a better term, Sunnistan is solved across the entire region from Baghdad into Syria. This is what we are not addressing, and I'm not talking about, you're well aware of it. People ask, how did this happen? How did the United States destroy the Sunni buffer against Iran? But when you start talking about this, we still talk in terms of Iraq and restoring sovereignty. Sovereignty of what? And so I really think this is the biggest strategic question in the region, and an enormous strategic question for the Arab Gulf, because it's this that will determine the nature and expansion of Iranian influence, all the way from Beirut to Uzbekistan. Give you another example. Thinking, state thinking. In other words, you have to have a state. So everyone's looking to do it. Is this Yemen? The UN says it is. The whole reconciliation process that fell on its nose was trying to create some kind of federalized structure around this. Well, I put 2 years in Yemen. I can promise you that one of these is Yemen. It's not a state in any Western sense, nor should it be treated as one, nor has it ever been. And in an attempt to deal with it, the U.S. foreign policy apparatus, where is the U.S. Embassy for the Republic of Yemen? It's in Amman, Jordan. How much sense does that make? Because it can't be in Yemen. What I'm saying is it requires a new way of thinking on our part about the region strategically. And it also, I think, requires a new level of honesty on the part of our regional partners in talking to us and saying, hey, what were you thinking when you destroyed the Sunni buffer in Iraq? What are you thinking about what comes next after Mosul? Is that just something that's handed over to that government in Baghdad who replaces those troops we trained and are fighting with Shia militias? It's very difficult for the United States, in particular the West in general, to operate outside this embassy central state mode, this, as I would call it, Westphalian Western mode. And now we've got it in spades across the region: Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq. We're just waiting on the next one to happen. Maybe it'll be Algeria. Here's the deal. We have to think about it differently. The proto-Western constructs, the republics, have failed. If you look at it right now, people today, I just completed a book, The Gulf and the Struggle for Hegemony. And most of the people that have read it have said, and a lot of the people that were very active in the 50s and 60s and 70s have said, you know, we really thought there was a new era in this whole progress thing. And suddenly we look at it and we say the foreword, John Voll at Georgetown, he says, we look at it, and obviously the states that have fared the best were the states that managed to keep their traditional forms of rule: the emirates, the monarchies, the sultanates. Morocco, Jordan, Oman, the Gulf, Saudi. I mean, if you wanted to be a citizen, would you rather be a citizen of one of those states, or would you rather live in the Republic of Yemen, the Republic of Iraq, the Republic of Syria, the Republic of Lebanon, or the Jamhuriya of Libya? You see what I'm saying? And it is very sobering, very serious, but I think we've got to think about it differently. Among Arab allies, it requires a more skeptical view of Western advice and priorities and differing interests. Look, we have some overall strategic interests, and they've driven the security system that started with the British and has lasted 250 years out here. But from time to time, we forget who we are and we don't really look at the interests in the region. As a result, bad advice from well-meaning friends, Western friends, is still bad advice. The Emir of Kuwait is a perfect example after the Gulf War and the occupation of Kuwait when he was forced to liberalize. And as soon as he liberalized, he developed an internal terrorism problem that took him years to beat down. Let me ask you a few questions. Will the Sunni areas of the Greater Levant ever be part of that colonial construct created in Syria and Iraq again under Shia and Alawite rule? Will they ever do that again voluntarily? I don't think so. After 5,000 years as a viable state with a military security apparatus backing the political apparatus, was it really reasonable for anybody to get excited about changes in Egypt in 2011? No. There's certain parameters of action. Wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to follow any preconceived Western democratic notions. The lines, the border area along the coast in North Africa, it's the same today. Literally, we're building berms, putting up patrol roads, building watchtowers, putting garrisons out there to protect the coastal areas from the interior, the ferment on the interior. And the first people, you know who they were that did that to try to protect their interests? The Romans 2,000 years ago. That's where that term lines comes from. Not much has changed. The Arab Gulf has modernized, maintained its stability and prosperity through traditional political institutions. Why change? Why listen to those people that say you have to change to improve yourself? You've proven that it works and it's reliable and it's stable. And oh, by the way, I'll put the track record of the Gulf states, even those that have had problems, like Bahrain, up against any of the other states in the region, the proto-Western states, on the issue of human rights, simply from the standpoint of body count. You see what I'm saying? There's no comparison in what the Gulf has accomplished as opposed to the other. Will Iran be anything other than an imperialist state, ever? Will the Persians ever say, this is all we want? You know, they haven't since the Achaemenids, the Sassanids, the Safavids, the Pavlovids. I can go down the list. It's not going to change. And so those people that think, well, if we get this agreement or that agreement, it just comes in another form. Post-war, Near East, South Asia has been largely viewed in the West in terms of Western notions of political development and structure. A patronage system, actually the United States has a patronage system too. If you don't believe it, look at the White House. A patronage system exists out here, but patronage is not the same thing as corruption. But these narrow views that come out of the West, we need to rethink how we look at things. And so, and it needs to be without Western preconceptions. External threats versus tactical security, okay? There are fundamental existential threats to the prosperity and stability of the Arab Gulf. And there are security threats. Security threats meaning Muslim Brotherhood, meaning AQXX, meaning ISXX, whatever you want to call it. Those have been remarkably well contained, with some difficulty at times, by security services, special forces, and police. The real existential threat to the Gulf out here, I don't think resides there. I think it resides with Iran and the potential Iran has to put pressure on the region. As a result, we have tunnel vision on terrorism, I believe, And I believe the threat is a lot broader and terrorism needs to be viewed as in the security context, whereas there's a broader issue here. There is little real understanding of the deep context. Little real understanding of the deep context. U.S. foreign policy community has difficulty thinking about or functioning outside the U.S. nation-state model. We're solution-oriented, and when there's not a solution, we get very frustrated. Actors must realistically assess what's possible, and this is local, and work toward acceptable political equilibrium. You can't solve the problem of Yemen. You have to have an equilibrium. U.S. foreign policy apparatus at this point has been largely undermined. Your leaders in the Gulf don't talk to the traditional role of embassies and stuff. They want to talk directly with Washington. Or the White House, actually. NSC at the lowest level. It's a different model. Terrorism, and our terrorism policy is all about protecting the homeland. That's first priority to anybody you talk to. And they're talking about our homeland. Policy parameters are increasingly determinant. The context dictates the policy. Little change between administrations. What I mean is, one administration comes in and says, okay, we're going to do this, but in the end, the policy looks very much the same. Since '92, we've had 4 administrations have had someone with little or no foreign policy experience making the ultimate decisions at the top. Rhetoric aside, there's very little difference between, say, Obama and Trump. What you need to do is look at what they say and then look at what they actually do to decide whether there's really a change. Well, these are examples. Clinton had all of these problems, and for political problems at home, couldn't act decisively against AQ. And he also had an attempted rapprochement with Iran that failed. Bush, 9/11, Afghanistan. Who won the Afghan and Iraq war? Iran. Maybe somebody in here would disagree with that, but that's what happened. Obama, nuclear agreement with Iran, top priority, no matter what short term it brought. Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, pullbacks because there's no solution, couldn't figure out what to do. Tactical counterterrorism, looking at the AQX, as we call it, whack-a-mole. Because that's really the best you could do without getting into something that was much more difficult and costly. Trump, a lot of promises, but we're really back to square one. In most fundamental ways, his policies are a reflection of Obama's policies. Show me where there's a significant difference. Think about it. U.S. administrations all view the Arab Gulf as an ally, but see Arab disagreements as counterproductive, in effect forcing a separate policy for each state. They call it hub and spoke. Bilateral multilateralism, I think. That's what Alberto referred to it. That term has been around for 15 or 20 years. So what happens is there's a general stated policy toward the Gulf, but actually the policies in the Gulf are directed at each individual state. Security counterterrorism, I would say the emphasis on strategic versus security interests is different. And the Arab states need to act in their own interests. Large regional states have different interests and views from smaller states. The smaller states have different views. The most important issue is protection of sovereignty for each of the states for survival. If you don't believe that, look at Kuwait in 1999. Gulf security system is a bilateral, multilateral set of alliances with the West that have produced prosperity, stability, and guaranteed security, along with traditional political institutions and rules. Stability in the Gulf is the most important interest the United States has in the region, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Because you take 20% of the world's oil out of the market, and it damages the industrial West. For the Arab Gulf, be careful about Western pronouncements of support. In other words, look at what they say, but really focus on what's done. And don't be afraid to ask hard questions about it. U.S. views of its regional interests often differ with those Arab Gulf views on specific issues. And I think it's healthy for both sides when we speak up. You know what I'm saying? The question, what were you thinking in Iraq? And what are you thinking in Iraq after Mosul? That's a legitimate question for anyone in the region. Because I'm not sure we have an answer for it. And if we don't, you need to know that. I'm reminded a friend of mine, very senior Gulf military officer, at the beginning of the Iraq invasion explained that we must have had a plan. He kept talking about the plan, and I said, I'm sorry, there's no plan. And he couldn't believe it. It took him 3 months to come around to the fact that we'd just blundered in something we couldn't get out. Because it was inconceivable somebody would do something on that scale. An inability to grasp that deeper context undermines our recognition, much less pursuit of our strategic interests and yours. You need help in that regard. And think about what those interests are and push those interests. If you think it's Iran, then you push that. Question? That's it.
And if you want any doubt, there'll be plenty of questions for Roby on those points. For that guy, please, your presentation.
Did everybody see the tweet? The Trump just tweeted. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Just wanted to start off with a little bit of levity here. My talk will be hopefully shorter, and we can get to the Q&A a little bit different. And hopefully I won't ruin it for bona fide journalists appearing at think tanks. It's unusual that we do, and I'm here. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Trends for hosting this event. Very important upcoming discussion that we're going to have. I'm an active American newspaper journalist, so my view of U.S. foreign policy is that of a reporter trying to be unbiased in the trenches. I travel around the world quite a bit, but I'm based in Washington, covering the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House National Security Council, trying to understand who the players are inside the team that has power in the American government in the right now, and how they're shaping policy. And then, this is key, if you're going to take anything away from my remarks, is that I try to explain it in really simple pedestrian terms, newspaper copy, that common readers can understand. So I was particularly excited to speak here today when I saw how the topic for this event was coming together, especially the rather blunt thesis that in the first year of the Trump presidency, Washington is failing to articulate a coherent or consistent foreign policy, and that this is creating confusion in the region. So let me start here by trying to unpack from where I sit in my unique position in all of this, what the real source of that confusion is right now. Here's what's happening. We have a very surprising and unusual new president in Washington. And he, like no other president, probably since Franklin Delano Roosevelt did with radio back about 90 years ago, in the early 1930s, that was when Roosevelt suddenly spoke directly into people's living rooms with something that were known as the fireside chats. Or perhaps the way that John Kennedy did a little bit with television in the early 1960s. Trump in that way he's seizing on or exploiting a media technology that is still very new to humanity. As familiar as we are with it already, it's really still brand new. He likes to say things on Twitter, truncated statements that seem ridiculously limited in scope and number of words, that when taken at face value can appear to totally contradict or to aggressively, suddenly, and even irresponsibly challenge what have been long-standing U.S. foreign policy positions, not just toward the Middle East, but toward a whole bunch of places around the world. President Trump's sudden tweets about Qatar early this summer, as the GCC diplomatic standoff unfolded, are as good an example as any. The president appeared to be saying one thing while his Secretary of State and even the Defense Secretary were seen to be scrambling to contradict it, say something else, more on message. This has repeated itself a few times on Syria, Afghanistan, North Korea, and so on. But here's what's important right now in trying to see how this administration is going to evolve. This confusion over these tweets is exacerbated pretty badly by the fact that despite the appointment of a few very experienced and qualified top cabinet members, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Defense Secretary James Mattis, and a few others, the administration so far has made really surprisingly limited progress in appointing what I like to call the mid-manager muscle of American foreign policy at the State Department and the Pentagon. And what do I mean by mid-manager muscle? Nearly all of the Assistant Secretary of State positions remain unfilled by any politically appointed person who's loyal to President Trump at this point. And the same goes for the Pentagon and many of the Undersecretary of Defense posts. Of course, these posts are filled, but they're filled by career diplomats and military officials on a kind of temporary, interim basis, and some are really qualified and deserving, but in reality, they're not people who know for sure what the White House policy actually is. They definitely agree with it and want to help promote it with clarity to U.S. embassies around the world. So the result is that there's this lack of a very essential muscle between the core inside, around the White House, around the president, and the people who are actually tasked with carrying out foreign policy. Why does that matter? Because without those mid-level managers, everyone else working beneath them in the field isn't sure what to say when a foreign ally asks, wait, what exactly is the new policy? What you get is a lack of clarity that causes, as the very apt Trends synopsis called it, confusion for the region. So where does that leave us? Well, despite the confusion, there's actually something else going on that I think is really important here in trying to figure out where we are right now with the Trump administration. It might be able to clear up some of the confusion, at least for the purposes of our discussion with regard to the GCC. I was talking to a former diplomat friend of mine, as we call them, sources, as journalists. I was talking to him the other day, and I'm not going to say who, but it was somebody who's been in one of those mid-manager muscle posts in a past Republican administration in Washington. Don't worry, they're not here today. They worked on an entirely different part of the world. Anyhow, as we got into this discussion about the lack of appointments by President Trump, my friend pointed out to me that 3 out of the 5 cabinet posts tasked with actually shaping President Trump's foreign policy, the really top positions, are now held by former U.S. Marine Corps generals. General Mattis at the Pentagon, H.R. McMaster as the National Security Advisor, and former General John Kelly as the Chief of Staff at the White House. All former U.S. Marine Corps generals. The word that my friend used to describe this was junta. Imagine that, a junta of former U.S. military generals suddenly surrounding the U.S. president. Let me be clear, I'm not saying that there's been some kind of military coup, and I actually think that the word junta is too strong a term, but there is something there. These are guys with really powerful positions, and they're viewing the world through the eyes of their experience as former U.S. military commanders, leaders in the field. This is something to consider for anyone trying to figure out where the Trump administration policy is going or likely to go in the coming years in the GCC region. I'll give one prediction on this. That group of former generals around the president sees the U.S. airbase in Qatar in a way that's really different from the president or other people who might have held these top foreign policy positions in a different administration. They see it through the eyes or through a U.S. military lens. And through that lens, it's an absolutely essential asset, a defining piece of America's long-term commitment and posture in the region. And the last thing that they want is for there to be a diplomatic crisis that could somehow disrupt that or complicate it. And it appears that Secretary of State Tillerson, the one guy in this group of five, other than UN's Ambassador Nikki Haley, who's not a Marine general, or a former Marine general, he understands and he agrees with the view that the generals have. So that's why the administration is right now scrambling to try to facilitate dialogue between the different sides on this, to try to get the diplomatic crisis resolved, get dialogue happening. I don't think the Trump administration is going to stop calling for that dialogue suddenly, anytime soon. And I also don't think the administration is going to truly take one side or the other. And I don't necessarily think that that's inconsistent with how the Obama administration handled the situation. This has been going on for a few years. Now, of course, there's the wild card that Trump could disrupt the whole thing with an incendiary tweet. We'll see. All right, moving on away from the whole why is there confusion in the policy issue. I want to try to take things up to a more macro level with a few minutes that I've got left here. Remember, I'm a journalist and we like to cram a lot into a story. I want to look at one of the big picture underpinnings of U.S. policy toward the whole Middle East over just the past 10 years. And I want to look at it through the media lens. It really most recently has to do with social media. So that there is a kind of parallel here to the Trump social media crisis going on back in Washington, and I'll get to that. But first, we have to take into consideration that during the aftermath of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, there was a lot of hand-wringing within the U.S. foreign policy and military establishment over what the heck is Washington really trying to promote? What's our message? What are we really trying to promote in the Middle East? Is it democracy? Is it freedom? Is it cohesion among Arab powers? Does it have to do with countering Iran? Is it something else? Weapons sales. A lot of hand-wringing. And to be honest with you, not a lot really came out of this hand-wringing. Instead, what happened was that an American-made product, a technology, suddenly began to eclipse and outpace the debate about where is Washington trying to push things. How many people have one of these right now? Actually, sorry, who's the one person here who doesn't have one of these? Raise your hand. How many people had one 10 years ago? I know that just about everybody had a cell phone back in 2007, but it really is just in the past 8 to 10 years that suddenly just about everyone has a handheld computer, a telephone, and more importantly, a portal to social media, immediate 24-hour media, all the time in the palm of their hand. The impact of this cannot be overstated. We could debate what happened with the aftermath of the Arab Spring, but we can probably all agree that social media was a huge and key catalyst that got the uprisings started or made them spread. And back in Washington, the Obama administration got really excited about that. They embraced the view that media freedom is a core American quality. It's in the DNA of American democracy, media freedom. And to some extent, American foreign policy projection. And they got behind this idea that it may be very good to promote that social media across the Middle East, especially to young people. Of course, we can debate, did they actually promote it, or was it just running rampant on its own, proliferating everywhere, and they really couldn't have controlled it even if they wanted to. It was almost as if you saw the satellite dish proliferation 10 years before, and that happened gradually. The movement of social media and handheld computers happened even faster than that did, and it changed the landscape all over again. It began to play this huge role, and it was American companies and technology, such as Facebook, that were right in the middle of it. So you could say that by a kind of proxy, pushing this technology was and has since been a decipherable aspect of U.S. foreign policy toward the whole region. Don't censor. Let it fly. See what happens. So what happened? It didn't take long before it wasn't just pro-democracy young people in a few cities running around mobilizing. It was also suddenly extremist groups that seized on this technology, using it to communicate with each other and, more importantly, using it in the internet more broadly. But social media is key to spread extremist propaganda and to recruit. Of course, bin Laden and AQ pioneered using the internet to recruit, but Daesh ran with it at a whole other level. This is why one of the big statements out of Washington about the extremist threat in recent years is something along the lines of, "We've never seen a group that could spread propaganda or recruit so widely and so rapidly as the Islamic State did. It happened fast. And now it presents a particularly vexing challenge for American foreign policy toward the Middle East. It's a very macro, big picture challenge. It's not about arguments between different groupings and countries next to each other. It's philosophical. How the Trump administration moves on it or does not move on it is going to be important in the coming years. Well, the debate about the usefulness of social media, is it this amazing thing that connects and empowers people, or is it a corrosive thing that dumbs down debates and spreads bad and potentially dangerous movements? Well, this debate actually played out behind the scenes of last year's election in the United States and seems even to have impacted who won the election. The debate is also right at the heart of U.S. thinking about the Middle East right now. And Washington is somewhat schizophrenic at the moment about the question of, should the U.S. government be promoting social media and trying to use it to connect people and create this kind of hyper-free media space? Or should the U.S. government be doing quite the opposite by trying instead to ramp up controls on this technology, controls on media, or by supporting regional leaders who ramp up such controls? Because without such controls, the really basic and in-the-moment threat of extremism is vastly more complex. The reason it's so tricky is that promoting tighter controls on media, any media, runs counter to that American DNA of media freedom. Imagine right now, in this moment of chaotic transition in Washington, when that mid-manager muscle layer is missing, the guidance and clarity over what the real U.S. foreign policy on this issue actually is has become even harder to ascertain right now. The broader, more basic point is that as simple as social media appears to be, with the Trump tweeting this or that, unfiltered and so, it's actually not so simple at all. And what I would propose is that we need more human, direct, in-person dialogue about this, not just this, but other issues, but about this issue. We need more than just partnerships that are behind the scenes or classified and trying to counter online extremism. We actually need more public events, discussions like we're about to have. So I hand it to Trends Research and Advisory for hosting this event today. I'm really excited to be here. It's an honor as an American journalist to be able to come and as we say in my business, to spitball for a few minutes. We're on the edge of a wave. We're not quite sure. Things could change as much as they have in the last 10 years with the way information moves. Expect that they will change that much again in the coming 10 years. I'm looking forward to a lively Q&A here. So thank you very much.